"The Duke only marries those who are alive to walk down the aisle." Lady Tilly Hopkins's voice sliced through the Atlantic wind like a blade. Her gloved hands pressed hard against Amber Smith's shoulder blades. "And you, Amber, are already a ghost." The edge of the Middleborough clefts crumbled beneath Amber's worn boots. Loose gravel skittered into the void, a 200-foot drop where the sea roared against chalk-white rock. Her arms pinwheeled desperately. One more inch and gravity would claim her. But why such cruelty? Why this venom from a woman who should have been family? Before this tragedy unfolds, we must journey backward through the fog of time. It was the spring of 1880 in Middleborough, England, where the scent of blooming jasmine drifted across stone estates and the entire county held its breath. Church bells rang across the moorlands, announcing what everyone had whispered for months. Sebastian Austen, Duke of Middleborough, had returned to claim a bride. The social season had begun. And so the preparations erupted. Mothers corseted their daughters until they could barely breathe. Fathers polished their pedigrees, and stepmothers schemed in lamplit parlors. In the shadowed halls of Hopkins Manor, two young women lived under one roof. One was Amber Smith, daughter of the late Charles Smith, whose portrait still watched from the great hall. The other was Abby Hopkins, raised on champagne promises and silk delusions. But only one would survive what came next. Amber woke before first light, as she always did. The attic room where she slept held no fireplace, and the floorboards of Hopkins Manor were coldest in the hour before dawn. She dressed quickly in the darkness, fastening the threadbare buttons of a gray cotton dress that once belonged to her mother. She could still remember her mother's laugh, bright, musical, extinguished too soon. Her father had remarried 2 years after pneumonia took her mother. Lady Tilly Hopkins had arrived with her daughter Abby, both draped in expensive mourning silks for a widower barely recovered from grief. Charles Smith had been desperate for companionship, for a mother figure for his beloved daughter. He had chosen catastrophically. Charles Smith died 4 years ago, a fall from his horse, they said. He struck his head on the garden fountain and never regained consciousness. Amber had been 18. Lady Tilly had seized control of the estate immediately, citing her position as widow and legal guardian. No one questioned a woman with a title and conviction. Downstairs, the kitchen was still dark. Amber lit the coal stove herself, boiled water for tea, and arranged the breakfast service. By the time the household staff arrived, half the morning duties were complete. Mrs. Isabel Rogers, the head housemaid, paused in the doorway. She was a woman of 45, with watchful eyes and measured words. Her black dress was plain but immaculate, her right apron starched to perfection. "You shouldn't be doing my work, Miss Amber." Amber smiled gently, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It gives me purpose." Isabel's expression tightened, but she held her tongue. She had served at Hopkins Manor for 20 years. She had watched Amber transform from a spirited child into a silent young woman who moved through the house like a ghost in service. She understood what silence could protect. Isabel stepped closer, dropping her voice to barely a whisper. "Lady Hopkins was looking for you last night after you'd retired. She seemed displeased you'd already gone to bed." Amber's hands froze over the silver teapot. "Did she say what she wanted?" "No, miss, but I'd advise caution today." Isabel's eyes flickered with warning. "The Duke's carriage was spotted on the London road yesterday evening." Amber's heart stuttered. "He's coming here." "So the rumors say." Isabel touched her arm briefly, a gesture of solidarity, before vanishing into the pantry. Amber stood alone in the kitchen, the silver locket containing her father's portrait cold against her chest, and felt the walls of her prison tightening. The morning light had barely touched the window panes when Amber finished scrubbing the entrance hall floors. Her knees ached from kneeling on cold marble, and her hands were raw from the lye soap, but she dared not slow her pace. Lady Tilly conducted inspections at precisely 8 o'clock, and any imperfection meant consequences. Hopkins Manor had once been her sanctuary. She could still remember running through these very halls as a child, her father chasing her with exaggerated roars of laughter, her mother watching from the music-room doorway with that gentle smile. The house had smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers then. Now it reeked of ambition and decay. You missed a spot near the door. Abby Hopkins descended the grand staircase like a peacock displaying its plumage, her morning dress of lavender silk rustling with each calculated step. Her blonde ringlets were already perfectly arranged, though the sun had barely risen. Mother will be furious if the Duke's carriage arrives and sees dirt on her floors. Amber didn't look up. I'll attend to it. See that you do. Abby paused at the bottom step, examining her reflection in the gilt mirror. Although I suppose it hardly matters, the Duke won't be looking at the floors when he sees me in my new French gown. Mother had it sent from Paris specifically for his visit. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Amber. That gown had been purchased with money from her father's estate, money that should have been hers. But Lady Tilly had systematically stripped away everything Charles Smith had left his daughter. First the inheritance, then the decent rooms, then her very identity as the daughter of the house. She scrubbed harder at the already spotless marble. By mid-morning, Amber had cleaned 6 fireplaces, polished the silver tea service, and beaten the dust from the drawing-room carpets. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, but she moved to the library next. This room she cleaned with particular care, not because Lady Tilly demanded it, but because it had been her father's favorite sanctuary. His collection of leather-bound books still lined the mahogany shelves. His reading chair still sat by the window, though no one used it now. Amber ran her fingers along the spines, remembering how he would read to her on rainy afternoons, adventure stories, poetry, scientific journals he claimed would expand her mind beyond the limitations society placed on young women. "You have a brilliant mind, my darling Amber," he used to say. "Never let anyone convince you to dim your light." But her light had been extinguished the day he died. She still remembered that morning with crystalline clarity. She had been in the garden cutting roses when the stable boy came running, his face white as chalk. There had been an accident. Her father's horse had thrown him near the fountain. The doctors said he struck his head on the stone edge. But Amber remembered other things, too. She remembered the argument she'd overheard the night before, her father's raised voice, Lady Tilly's cold responses. She remembered that her father's horse, Galileo, was the gentlest creature in the stable, never spooked by anything. She remembered the strange bruising on her father's temple that didn't quite match the story of a fountain's edge. She had been 18 and grief-stricken. No one listened to a mourning girl's suspicions. Within a week, Lady Tilly had produced a revised will naming her as primary beneficiary and guardian. Within a month, Amber had been moved from her childhood bedroom to the servants' quarters. Within 6 months, she was indistinguishable from the household staff, except that she received no wages and could never leave. "What are you doing in here?" Lady Tilly's voice cut through her memories like a knife through silk. She stood in the doorway, her black day dress severe and elegant, her expression glacial. "This room doesn't need your attention. The Duke won't be entertained in a dusty library full of dead men's books." Amber stepped back from the shelves. You were only wasting time that should be spent preparing for our distinguished guest." Lady Tilly advanced into the room, her eyes narrowing. "I suppose I should be grateful you're keeping yourself occupied and out of sight. We wouldn't want the Duke to mistake you for anyone of consequence." The words landed like physical blows, but Amber kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. Lady Tilly circled her slowly, assessing. "That dress is a disgrace. Even for a servant you look positively destitute. But I suppose it doesn't matter. You'll remain in the kitchens during the Duke's visit. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your tragic orphan performance." "Yes, Lady Hopkins. And don't think I haven't noticed you touching your father's things." Lady Tilly's voice dropped to something dangerous. "This estate belongs to me now. Everything in it, including you. The sooner you accept your place, the easier your existence will be." She swept from the room, leaving only the scent of rosewater and threat. Amber stood alone among her father's books, her hand unconsciously rising to the silver locket at her throat. Inside was a miniature portrait of Charles Smith, painted the year before he died. It was the only thing of his she'd managed to hide from Lady Tilly's purge. She whispered to his image, as she did every morning, "I haven't forgotten what happened to you, and I won't let her win." But even as she made the vow, she wondered how long she could survive in the ashes of her former life. Sebastian Austen, Duke of Middlesbrough, had endured precisely 14 marriage-minded mothers in the span of 3 days, and his patience had worn thinner than the tea being served in their drawing-rooms. London had become insufferable. Every ballroom, every garden party, every carefully orchestrated chance encounter featured the same performance: simpering daughters with rehearsed laughs and mothers wielding family pedigrees like weapons. They spoke of nothing but fashion and gossip, their conversations as shallow as puddles after rain. So he had fled to his estate in Middlesbrough, seeking solitude and the sharp salt air of the Atlantic coast. His steward had protested. There were obligations, social expectations, a ducal responsibility to secure the family line. Sebastian had ignored him entirely. The morning he arrived at Middlesbrough Hall, he rose before dawn out of habit. Years in the military had trained his body to wake with the first hint of light, and civilian life hadn't broken the pattern. He dressed simply, no valet, no ceremony, and slipped out through the terrace doors while the household still slept. The garden stretched before him in the pearl-grey light of early morning, wild roses climbing over stone walls and morning dew silvering the grass. He walked without destination, breathing deeply of air untainted by coal smoke and perfume. That's when he saw her. She knelt in the rose garden near the eastern wall, her threadbare grey dress already damp from the wet grass. Dark curls escaped from beneath a simple kerchief, and her hands worked with practiced efficiency, trimming dead blooms and gathering fresh cuttings into a wicker basket. She moved with unconscious grace, humming something soft and melancholy. Sebastian stopped walking. He had seen countless women in elaborate gowns and jewels, but something about this girl arrested him completely. Perhaps it was the way the dawn light caught in her hair, or the concentration on her face as she cradled a perfect white rose, or simply the fact that she clearly had no idea she was being observed. "Those are particularly fine specimens," he said. She startled violently, nearly dropping her basket. When she looked up, her eyes were the color of amber held to sunlight, golden brown with flecks of green. For a moment, those eyes were unguarded, intelligent, alive. Then recognition flickered across her face. She knew who he was, and something shuddered behind them. She scrambled to her feet, executing an awkward curtsy. "Your Grace, forgive me, I didn't realize you'd arrived. I shouldn't be—" "You shouldn't be tending the gardens?" Sebastian smiled. "I'm fairly certain that's exactly what you should be doing, considering you're holding pruning shears and a basket of roses." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I meant I shouldn't be in your way, Your Grace." "You're not." He stepped closer, genuinely curious now. "You clearly know your roses. That's a Madame Hardy, isn't it?" He gestured to the white bloom in her basket. Surprise flickered across her face. "Yes,
She caught herself. Yes, Your Grace. It's one of the oldest varieties in the garden. Your father taught you? Sebastian noted the correction, the careful way she'd swallowed whatever she'd been about to say. He loved roses. Her voice softened. He said they were proof that beautiful things could have thorns and still be worth cultivating. Sebastian studied her more carefully. She spoke with an education that didn't match her servant's dress. Her posture, despite the curtsy, held an inherent dignity. And those eyes, there was a depth of sadness there that spoke of losses greater than dead flowers. "What's your name?" She hesitated, and he could see her weighing what answer to give. "Amber, Your Grace." "Amber," he repeated it, finding he liked the way it sounded. "It suits you, the color of your eyes." She looked down quickly, as if the observation frightened her. "I should return to the kitchens. They'll be wondering where I've gone." "Wait." He reached out instinctively, though he didn't touch her. "Will you be here tomorrow morning? I'd like to learn more about the gardens." The question clearly confused her. I'm not certain, Your Grace. Lady Hopkins may have other duties for me." "Lady Hopkins?" Sebastian's brow furrowed. "Of Hopkins Manor?" "Yes, Your Grace." Something flickered in her expression. Was it fear? "I should go." She fled before he could ask another question, her basket swinging, her worn boots whispering through the wet grass. Sebastian watched her disappear through a servant's entrance, his mind already working through the pieces that didn't fit. A girl with educated speech and tragic eyes, who knew roses and literature, working as a servant for Lady Hopkins, who spoke of her father in the past tense with such profound grief. The Duke of Middleborough had come to his estate seeking peace and solitude. Instead, he had found a mystery wrapped in starlight and thorns.
Lady Tilly Hopkins had not clawed her way to the precipice of aristocratic triumph only to watch it crumble because of a servant girl with unfortunate eyes. She had seen them in the garden that morning. From her bedroom window she had watched the Duke of Middleborough himself, speaking with Amber as if she were a lady of quality rather than the penniless orphan she truly was. Worse, she had seen the way Sebastian Austen looked at the girl, with interest, with curiosity, with the beginning of fascination. That could not stand. Lady Tilly descended to the kitchens at noon, her heels striking the stone steps with military precision. The servants scattered like mice before a cat, but Amber remained at the scullery sink, her hands submerged in grey dishwater, her shoulders tensed as if bracing for impact. "You were in the gardens this morning." Lady Tilly's voice was silk wrapped around steel. "The Duke's gardens." Amber didn't turn around. "I was cutting roses for the house arrangements, as I do every morning." "Don't lie to me, girl." Lady Tilly stepped closer, close enough that Amber would feel her presence like a shadow. "I saw you speaking with him. I saw you making eyes at a man so far above your station he might as well be the sun itself." "I didn't—" The slap came without warning, sharp and precise across Amber's cheek. The crack echoed through the kitchen. 2 scullery maids gasped and fled. Mrs. Rogers stood frozen by the pantry door, her face pale, but her eyes burning with helpless rage. Amber's hand rose to her face, but she kept her gaze lowered. She had learned long ago that meeting Lady Tilly's eyes during these moments only made the punishment worse. "You didn't what?" Lady Tilly hissed. "You didn't flutter your lashes at him? You didn't speak to him as if you had any right to his attention? Do you know what you are, Amber? You are a charity case, a burden I accepted out of the goodness of my heart when your father died and left nothing but debts." The lies came so easily to Lady Tilly now that Amber wondered if she'd convinced herself they were true. Charles Smith had left a considerable fortune. Lady Tilly had simply stolen it. "I apologize, Lady Hopkins." Amber kept her voice steady, emotionless. "It won't happen again." "No, it won't." Lady Tilly circled her slowly, calculating. Because you won't be visible during the Duke's visit tomorrow. You'll remain in the kitchens, out of sight, and should you happen to cross his paths, should you even breathe in his direction, you'll wear a veil." Amber's head snapped up. "A veil! Did I stutter?" Lady Tilly's smile was vicious. "We can't have our distinguished guest disturbed by the sight of a servant who doesn't know her place. Besides, that mark on your cheek is rather unsightly. We wouldn't want anyone getting the wrong impression about how we run this household." Mrs. Rogers made a small sound of protest. Lady Tilly's gaze cut toward her like a blade. "Do you have something to say, Mrs. Rogers?" The housekeeper's jaw worked, but ultimately shook her head. "No, my lady." "Good. Then you'll ensure Amber understands her instructions. She is to remain below stairs. She is to wear the mourning veil from the attic trunk. And should I catch even a whisper of her attempting to draw the Duke's attention," Lady Tilly leaned close to Amber, her breath hot against her ear, "I will make you wish your father's horse had trampled you alongside him." The threat hung in the air like poison. Lady Tilly swept from the kitchen, leaving destruction in her wake. The moment her footsteps faded, Mrs. Rogers rushed to Amber's side. "Let me see." She gently turned Amber's face toward the light. The mark was already darkening to purple, the shape of fingers clear against pale skin. "Oh, child, this is beyond cruelty." "It's nothing I haven't survived before." Amber's voice was hollow. She returned to the dishes, her hands trembling only slightly as they sank back into the cold water. "You should tell someone, the Duke, perhaps, if he knew. If he knew, it would only make things worse." Amber scrubbed at a pot with vicious intensity. "She'd find a way to turn it back on me. She always does." Mrs. Rogers opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She had worked for Lady Tilly long enough to know the woman's capacity for manipulation. Any accusation would be twisted, any witness intimidated, any evidence destroyed. "At least let me tend that bruise. There's no point. I'll be wearing a veil tomorrow anyway." The bitter laugh that escaped Amber's throat was more sob than mirth. "She thinks of everything, doesn't she? Can't have the Duke seeing what she's done. Can't have him wondering why a servant is marked like a criminal." That evening, Mrs. Rogers brought the mourning veil to Amber's attic room. It was heavy black lace, the kind worn by widows in deep grief, designed to obscure the face completely. Amber held it in her hands like a shroud. "You don't have to wear this," Mrs. Rogers whispered. "You could leave tonight. I have a sister in Dover who—" "And go where?" Amber met her eyes, and the housekeeper saw the terrible resignation there. "With what money? Wearing what clothes? Lady Tilly made certain I have nothing. No references, no connections, no proof I'm anything more than what she claims, a charity case with delusions of grandeur. Your father's will was rewritten before he was cold in his grave. You know that." Amber folded the veil carefully, precisely. "This is my life now, Mrs. Rogers. I've accepted it." But as the housekeeper left and darkness fell over Hopkins Manor, Amber stood at her narrow window and looked toward the lights of Middleborough Hall in the distance. She touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling the outline of her father's portrait through the metal. "I haven't forgotten," she whispered to the night. "I haven't forgotten what she took from us." The bruise on her cheek throbbed in agreement, a physical reminder of the cage she lived in. Tomorrow the Duke would visit, and she would be invisible behind black lace, erased as thoroughly as if she'd never existed at all. Mrs. Isabel Rogers had served in great houses for 30 years, and she had learned that servants saw everything, while being seen as nothing. It was a particular form of invisibility that afforded certain advantages, particularly when one's employers were engaged in criminal activity. She discovered Lady Tilly's latest scheme quite by accident. It was late evening, 3 days after the Duke's first visit to Hopkins Manor. The household had retired for the night, but Mrs. Rogers had returned downstairs to retrieve her reading spectacles from the housekeeper's pantry. As she passed the study, she noticed a sliver of lamplight beneath the door. Lady Tilly never worked in the study this late. The woman kept aristocratic hours, retiring promptly at 10 o'clock with a glass of sherry and her French fashion periodicals. Mrs. Rogers' blood ran cold. "And absolutely certain the signature is indistinguishable." Lady Tilly's voice was crisp, businesslike. "I've been forging documents for 20 years, my lady." The second voice was male, unfamiliar, with a coarse London accent. "Charles Smith's hand was simple enough, educated but not ornamental. This will appear authentic to any solicitor in England." Mrs. Rogers's blood ran cold. "And the witness signatures?" "Already applied. 2 housemaids and a footman who conveniently died in the years since. A housemaid and a footman. No one to contradict the document's validity." "Excellent." The sound of papers rustling. "This new will makes it explicit that Amber Smith was disinherited due to mental instability and moral deficiency. Everything passes to me as the widow, with provisions for my daughter Georgina's marriage settlement." "Bit harsh on the girl, isn't it?" The forger's voice held a note of curiosity rather than concern. Lady Tilly's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "The girl is fortunate I allow her to remain under this roof at all. If she continues to attract unwanted attention from certain quarters, however, I may need to consider more permanent solutions." Mrs. Rogers's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "How permanent are we discussing?" "That depends entirely on whether the Duke's interest in her persists." A pause. "There are asylums that accept inconvenient young women, no questions asked. A generous donation, a doctor's signature claiming hysteria or melancholia, and Amber Smith disappears into institutional care for the rest of her natural life." The forger whistled low. "You're a cold one, Lady Hopkins." "I'm a practical one. My daughter will marry the Duke of Middleborough, and nothing, especially not a sentimental orphan with delusions of reclaiming her father's estate, will interfere with that outcome." Mrs. Rogers had heard enough. She backed away from the door on trembling legs, her mind racing. An asylum. Lady Tilly was planning to have Amber committed to an asylum. And this forged will would ensure no one could challenge her legal authority to do so. She had to act, but carefully. The next morning, Mrs. Rogers rose an hour earlier than usual and dressed in her best walking dress. She told the cook she had personal business in town and would return by afternoon. Then she walked the 2 miles to Middleborough Hall, her resolve hardening with each step. The Duke's steward, Mr. Henry Blackwood, received her in his office overlooking the estate's rose gardens. He was a man in his 50s with shrewd grey eyes and the bearing of someone who had managed ducal affairs for decades. "Mrs. Rogers, isn't it, from Hopkins Manor?" He gestured to a chair. "How may I assist you?" She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times during her walk, but now that the moment arrived, the words tumbled out in an urgent rush. "Mr. Blackwood, I have information regarding Miss Amber Smith, information I believe the Duke should know." Blackwood's expression sharpened. "Go on." She told him everything. Charles Smith's mysterious death, Lady Tilly's immediate seizure of the estate, Amber's transformation from gentleman's daughter to household servant, the bruises, the punishments, the calculated cruelty. And finally, what she had overheard the previous night, the forged will, the asylum threat, Lady Tilly's determination to eliminate any obstacle to her daughter's marriage prospects. When she finished, Blackwood sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Rogers." "I'm aware, sir, but they're true, every word, and that girl is in danger, real danger." She leaned forward. "I've seen how the Duke looks at her. Lady Tilly has seen it too, and a woman like that, when threatened, is capable of anything. Why come to me? Why not go directly to the magistrate?" Mrs. Rogers gave him a weary smile. Because Lady Tilly Hopkins has cultivated relationships with every person of influence in this county. She hosts their dinner parties, flatters their wives, contributes to their charitable causes. A housekeeper's word against a titled widow, I'd be dismissed as a disgruntled servant seeking attention. But you believe the Duke would listen. I believe the Duke is a man of honor, and I believe, she hesitated, then pressed forward, I believe he cares what happens to Miss Amber, perhaps more than he realizes yet. Blackwood was quiet again, weighing her words against what he knew of his employer. The Duke had been peculiarly distracted since his visit to Hopkins Manor. He had asked pointed questions about the Smith family history and Lady Hopkins's marriage to Charles Smith. He had even requested that Blackwood make discreet inquiries into the circumstances of Charles Smith's death. "What do you need from me, Mrs. Rogers?" "Evidence, legal recourse, protection for that girl before Lady Tilly makes good on her threats." Mrs. Rogers' voice cracked slightly. "I've watched her suffer for 4 years, Mr. Blackwood. I've stood by because I had no power to intervene. But if there's a chance now, if the Duke's interest provides an opening—" "I'll speak with His Grace today." Blackwood stood, his decision made. "In the meantime, I need you to document everything you can, dates, incidents, witnesses if there are any, and if you overhear anything else regarding this forged will or the asylum threat, you'll know immediately." Mrs. Rogers rose as well, relief flooding through her. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You have no idea what this means." As she walked back to Hopkins Manor, the morning sun breaking through the coastal fog, Mrs. Rogers allowed herself the first spark of hope she had felt in years. She was no longer just a silent witness. She had become an agent of justice. And God help Lady Tilly Hopkins when the truth finally came to light. The invitation to the Middleborough masquerade had arrived at Hopkins Manor on cream-coloured paper with the Duke's seal pressed into crimson wax. Lady Tilly had clutched it to her chest like a holy relic, already envisioning Abby's triumph, the moment when Sebastian Austen would choose her daughter from among all the eligible ladies of the county. She had not, of course, extended the invitation to Amber. But Mrs. Rogers had other plans. "Your mother's gown has been in the attic for years," the housekeeper whispered, pressing a wrapped bundle into Amber's hands 2 nights before the ball. "She would have wanted you to wear it. She would have wanted you to remember who you truly are." Amber unfolded the dress with trembling fingers. It was pale gold silk, the color of champagne and candlelight, with delicate pearl beading across the bodice. The style was several years old, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. Her mother had worn this to her final ball before the fever took her. "I can't," Amber breathed. "If Lady Tilly discovers—" "Lady Tilly and Abby will leave 2 hours before the ball begins. They always arrive early to secure the best positions." Mrs. Rogers' eyes glinted with defiant determination. "You'll take the servant's carriage, you'll wear a mask, and for 1 night, Amber Smith, you'll remind the world that you exist." The night of the masquerade, Amber stood before the cracked mirror in her attic room and barely recognized herself. The gold gown fit as if it had been made for her, and perhaps it had, for she had her mother's figure. Mrs. Rogers had arranged her dark curls into an elegant style, weaving pearl pins throughout. The mask was simple but striking, white silk with gold filigree covering the upper half of her face. She touched the silver locket at her throat, the only jewelry she owned, and whispered to her parents, "Give me courage." Middleborough Hall blazed with light. Carriages lined the circular drive, and music spilled from the open windows into the cool spring night. Amber slipped through the servants' entrance and ascended the back stairs, emerging into the ballroom just as the dancing began. The room was a sea of masks and silk, of feathers and jewels. Amber pressed herself against the wall, overwhelmed by the spectacle.
She had attended balls here as a child, standing beside her father as he greeted guests, but that felt like a lifetime ago, a dream belonging to a different girl. "You're new?" The voice came from directly behind her, rich and amused. "I'm certain I would have remembered that particular shade of gold." Amber turned and found herself face to face with a man in a black domino mask and evening dress, but she would have known him anywhere, the Duke of Middleborough. His eyes, visible above the mask, were the same intelligent grey that had studied her in the rose garden. "Your Grace," she curtsied, keeping her voice low, hoping the mask would protect her identity. "No titles tonight," he offered his gloved hand. "It's a masquerade. We're all delightfully anonymous. May I have this dance?" She should have refused. She should have fled. But his hand was extended, and the music was calling, and for one reckless moment Amber chose to be brave. "Yes." He led her on to the dance floor, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. The waltz began, and they moved together as if they'd danced 100 times before. Sebastian studied her face, or what he could see of it, with growing fascination. "You're an excellent dancer," he observed. "My father insisted I learn." The words slipped out before she could stop them. "Did he?" Something shifted in Sebastian's expression. "And what else did your father insist upon?" "That I read widely, that I think independently, that I never apologize for being intelligent." Her voice wavered. "That I remember beauty can have thorns and still be worth cultivating."
Sebastian's steps faltered. His hand tightened on her waist. "Amber?" She looked up, meeting his eyes through her mask, and saw recognition blazing there. "It's you," he breathed. "The girl from the gardens. But how?" "I shouldn't be here." Panic flooded through her. "Please, you mustn't tell anyone." "Tell anyone?" He pulled her closer as the waltz turned. "I have no intention of letting you out of my sight. Do you have any idea how I've been searching for?" "Sebastian!" The voice cut through the music like a blade. Lady Tilly Hopkins stood at the edge of the dance floor, her face white with fury beneath her elaborate peacock mask. Beside her, Abby's expression crumbled from confusion to humiliation as she recognized the gold dress, the dark curls, the silver locket. The music died. Couples stopped dancing. Every masked face turned toward the unfolding drama. Lady Tilly advanced across the floor, her hands clenched into fists. "That dress! That's Eleanor Smith's dress! And that means—" She reached out and ripped the mask from Amber's face, exposing her to the crowded ballroom. "This servant girl has dared to infiltrate the Duke's ball, pretending to be a lady of quality." Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. Amber stood frozen, exposed, waiting for the floor to open and swallow her whole. But Sebastian didn't release her. Instead, he stepped slightly in front of her, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "This woman is no servant, Lady Hopkins. This is Miss Amber Smith, daughter of the late Charles Smith, and she is here as my personal guest." Lady Tilly's face twisted into something ugly and desperate. "Guest? She's a charity case, living on my generosity, working in my kitchens because she has nothing else." "That's a lie." Sebastian's voice cut like steel. "And I believe we both know it." The Duke's steward, Mr. Blackwood, appeared at the edge of the crowd, holding a sheaf of papers. His timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Lady Tilly saw those papers, and something wild entered her eyes. She looked at Amber, really looked at her, and in that moment Amber saw murder reflected there. "You," Lady Tilly hissed, "you've ruined everything." She turned and fled the ballroom, Abby stumbling after her in tears. Sebastian turned to Amber, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Are you all right?" But Amber was staring at the doorway where Lady Tilly had disappeared, and her blood had turned to ice. She knew that look. She had seen it once before, on the morning her father died. "She's going to kill me," she whispered, "just like she killed him."
Sebastian Austen had orchestrated military campaigns and navigated the treacherous waters of parliamentary politics, but he had never felt fear quite like this, the cold, visceral terror of knowing someone he cared for was in mortal danger. He escorted Amber from the ballroom to his private study, Mrs. Rogers and Mr. Blackwood following close behind. Amber was trembling, her gold gown catching the lamplight as she sank into a chair. "Tell me everything," Sebastian said, kneeling before her. "Everything about your father's death." The story poured out in fragments, the argument she'd overheard, the impossibility of gentle Galileo throwing an experienced rider, the bruising that didn't match the alleged fall, Lady Tilly's immediate seizure of the estate, and the suspiciously convenient revised will that appeared within days. I was 18 and grief-stricken. No one would listen to a mourning girl's suspicions, and by the time I understood what had truly happened, Lady Hopkins had systematically destroyed any evidence or witnesses who might have supported my claims. Blackwood stepped forward, laying the papers he'd carried on Sebastian's desk. "Your Grace, I've been conducting inquiries as you requested. The original stable-master, the one who found Mr. Smith's body, left Hopkins Manor's employ 2 weeks after the death. I tracked him to Southampton. He's willing to testify that the horse showed no signs of spooking, and that Lady Hopkins insisted the body be moved before the magistrate arrived." "That's tampering with evidence," Sebastian said sharply. "Indeed. There's more." Blackwood produced another document. The physician who examined Mr. Smith's body noted inconsistencies in his private journal, injuries that suggested a struggle rather than a simple fall. But his official report, the one submitted to the magistrate, contained none of these observations. "She paid him off," Amber whispered, "or threatened him." Blackwood's expression was grim. "The physician died last year, but his journal survived. His widow was willing to provide it once I explained the circumstances." Sebastian stood, his mind already working through the legal mechanisms. "We need the magistrate involved immediately. These documents, combined with Mrs. Rogers's testimony about the forged will and the asylum threats." "It won't be enough." Amber's voice was hollow. "Not in time. You saw her face tonight, Sebastian. She's cornered, desperate. She won't wait for magistrates and legal proceedings." "Then you'll stay here," Sebastian declared, "under my protection. Lady Hopkins won't dare." "Won't she?" Amber met his eyes. "I'm a servant in her household, legally bound to her guardianship until I reach majority. If I simply disappear into the Duke's residence, she'll claim I'm hysterical, unbalanced. She'll use it as evidence to support her asylum claim." "Then we'll marry." The words left his mouth before he'd fully considered them, but once spoken, he realized he meant them completely. "Tonight, a special license can be obtained. As my wife, you'd be beyond her reach." Amber stared at him. "You can't mean that." "Why can't I?" Sebastian moved closer. "I've been half in love with you since that morning in the rose garden. I've spent the past week trying to understand why a woman with your education and bearing was working as a servant. Now I know the truth, and I'll be damned if I let that monster hurt you further." "Sebastian!" His name on her lips was achingly soft. "I have nothing. No dowry, no family, no reputation after tonight's scandal. You're a duke. You could have anyone." "I don't want anyone. I want the woman who knows her roses and quotes her father's wisdom. I want the woman who has survived 4 years of cruelty and still has starlight in her eyes. I want you, Amber."
Mrs. Rogers made a small sound of approval, but Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Grace, while I admire the sentiment, a hasty marriage would indeed play into Lady Hopkins' narrative. The Archbishop won't issue a special license without questions, particularly given the scandal tonight. We need at least 3 days to navigate the ecclesiastical requirements." 3 days. Sebastian's jaw tightened. What happens in those 3 days? "I return to Hopkins Manor Amber said quietly. "I behave as the perfect cowed servant. I give her no reason to accelerate her plans." "Absolutely not." Sebastian's voice was fierce. "I won't use you as bait." "I'm already bait," Amber countered. "At least this way we control the circumstances." She turned to Blackwood. "You said you have evidence. How long until you can present it to the magistrate?" 2 days, perhaps 3. I need to gather the witnesses and prepare formal depositions." "Then that's our timeline." Amber stood, decision hardening her features. 2 days of playing the broken servant while Mr. Blackwood builds the case. On the 3rd day, when the evidence is ready, we move against her legally." "And if she moves first?" Sebastian demanded. Amber's hand rose to her locket. "Then you'll need to be very, very fast." Sebastian wanted to argue, to lock her in Middleborough Hall and throw away the key, but he saw the steel in her spine. She had survived this long by being clever and cautious. He had to trust her judgment now. "Mrs. Rogers stays with you," he insisted, "every moment, and if Lady Hopkins so much as looks at you wrong, I'll signal immediately. I'm not brave, Sebastian, just desperate, and desperate people are either very foolish or very dangerous." She left an hour later, returning to Hopkins Manor in the servant's carriage, her mother's gold gown carefully wrapped. Sebastian watched from the window, every instinct screaming that he was making a catastrophic mistake. Blackwood stood beside him. "It's a sound plan, Your Grace." "It's a trap," Sebastian corrected grimly. "The question is whether we've set it for Lady Hopkins or whether she's setting it for us." In her bedroom at Hopkins Manor, Lady Tilly Hopkins stared at her reflection in the mirror and watched her carefully constructed world crumble to dust. The Duke knew. That wretched girl had poisoned him against Abby, had destroyed years of planning with one forbidden dance. Her hands trembled as she poured brandy, then steadied as she drank. If legal channels were closing against her, she would need to act outside them. The cliffs of Middleborough were treacherous this time of year. Accidents happened so easily, and orphan girls who reach beyond their station, they fell.
Lady Tilly Hopkins wore kindness like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting and obviously temporary. The morning after the masquerade, she descended to the kitchens where Amber was scrubbing pots with raw, blistered hands. Her expression was soft, almost maternal, and that alone set every alarm bell ringing in Amber's mind. "My dear girl," Lady Tilly said, her voice dripping with false warmth, "I've been thinking about last night, about how harshly I've treated you." Amber kept scrubbing, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Yes, Lady Hopkins. I was overcome with emotion. Seeing you in your mother's dress brought back such memories." Lady Tilly sighed dramatically. "Your father loved her so dearly, and I realize now that in my grief over losing him, I've been unkind to the one person who reminds me most of his goodness." Every word was poison wrapped in sugar. "I want to make amends," Lady Tilly continued. "I thought perhaps we might take a trip together, just the two of us, a reconciliation of sorts. There's a lovely spot along the Middleborough cliffs. Your father used to take you there as a child, do you remember?" Amber's hands stilled in the dishwater. She remembered. The white chalk cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, where wildflowers grew in defiant patches and the drop was sheer and deadly. Her father had held her hand tightly during those visits, warning her never to go near the edge alone. "I remember," she whispered. "Then it's settled. We'll have a picnic this afternoon. Fresh air and honest conversation. Perhaps we can find our way back to being a family." Lady Tilly's smile was all teeth. "What do you say, Amber?" This was it. The trap was sprung. Amber could refuse, could run to Sebastian and beg for protection, but that would only delay the inevitable. Lady Tilly was desperate now, and desperate predators were most dangerous when cornered. Better to face it on her terms, better to have witnesses ready. "That sounds lovely, Lady Hopkins." Amber met her stepmother's eyes and saw the flicker of triumph there. "I'd be honored." Mrs. Rogers found Amber an hour later packing a picnic basket in the pantry.
The housekeeper's face was ashen. "You can't go with her," Mrs. Rogers hissed. "Child, she means to kill you." "I know." Amber's hands were steady as she wrapped cheese in cloth. "Send word to the Duke immediately. Tell him to go to the cliffs above Whitestone Bay. Tell him to come armed and with witnesses. Amber, and it ends today, one way or another." Amber gripped the woman's hands. "Promise me you'll send word. Promise me Sebastian will know where to find me." The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "God keep you, child." The carriage ride to the cliffs was silent. Lady Tilly sat across from Amber, her expression serene, her gloved hands folded primly in her lap, but Amber could see the muscle twitching in her jaw, the barely contained violence simmering beneath the civilized veneer. They arrived at the cliff top just after noon. The Atlantic spread before them like hammered silver, and the wind carried the salt tang of the sea. Amber stepped from the carriage, her boots crunching on loose gravel, and felt her mother's locket press cold against her skin. "Isn't it beautiful?" Lady Tilly breathed, moving to stand near the edge. "Your father loved this view. He said it reminded him that England would endure long after we were all dust." Amber stayed back, keeping distance between herself and the precipice. "Why are we really here, Lady Tilly?" The mask dropped. Lady Tilly's face transformed from benevolent stepmother to something cold and reptilian. "Because you've destroyed everything. My daughter's future, my position, my carefully constructed life."
"You destroyed it yourself." Amber's voice was steady despite her terror. "The moment you murdered my father." "Murdered?" Lady Tilly laughed, a harsh sound swallowed by the wind. "I saved him from poverty. Charles Smith was a fool who spent every penny on books and roses and romantic notions. He would have bankrupted the estate within 5 years. So you killed him and stole his fortune. I secured my daughter's future." Lady Tilly advanced, and Amber stumbled backward toward the cliff's edge. "Everything I've done has been for Abby, and then you, with your tragic eyes and your dead mother's grace, you seduced the Duke who was meant to be hers." "I didn't seduce anyone. Sebastian saw through your lies." "Sebastian?" Lady Tilly's face contorted with rage. "You dare speak his Christian name? You, who are nothing but a servant, a charity case, a ghost that should have been buried with your father." Amber's heel struck loose gravel. She glanced back and saw the drop, 200 feet of white chalk falling away to jagged rocks and churning sea. Her heart seized with primal terror. "This ends now," Lady Tilly hissed, her hands rising. "The Duke only marries those who are alive to walk down the aisle, and you, Amber, are already a ghost." She lunged forward, palms outstretched. Amber tried to dodge, but there was nowhere to go. Lady Tilly's hands connected with her shoulder blades, shoving with brutal force. Amber's feet left solid ground. The world tilted sickeningly. Her scream tore through the coastal wind as gravity claimed her. She fell. Her fingers scrabbled desperately at the cliff face, found a ridge of chalk, gripped. Pain exploded through her shoulders as her body jerked to a halt, dangling over oblivion. The chalk was crumbling beneath her fingers. She wouldn't last more than seconds. Above her, Lady Tilly peered over the edge, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "Goodbye, Amber Smith." "No!" The roar came from behind Lady Tilly. Sebastian Austin threw himself from his still-moving horse and sprinted across the cliff top. Behind him, Mr. Blackwood and 2 constables emerged from a second carriage. Sebastian dropped to his stomach at the cliff's edge, his arm shooting out to catch Amber's wrist just as the chalk crumbled completely beneath her fingers. His grip locked around her like iron. "I've got you," he gasped. "Hold on, Amber, hold on."
Lady Tilly screamed in fury and lunged toward them, but Blackwood tackled her to the ground. The constables were there in seconds, restraining her as she thrashed and shrieked. Sebastian hauled Amber upward, his muscles straining, refusing to let gravity win. Inch by agonizing inch, he pulled her back from death. Other hands joined his, Blackwood, the constable's, and together they dragged her over the edge onto solid ground. Amber collapsed against Sebastian's chest, sobbing and shaking. His arms wrapped around her like a fortress. "You're safe," he whispered in her hair. "You're safe now. I've got you." Lady Tilly's screams echoed across the cliffs as the constables hauled her toward the carriage, but Amber didn't look. She pressed her face against Sebastian's chest and let herself finally break. The nightmare was over.
The magistrate's office in Middleborough was a room of dark wood and dusty law books, but on this particular afternoon it served as the stage for justice long delayed. Lady Tilly Hopkins sat in shackles, her elegant travelling dress torn and muddied from her struggle on the cliff top. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and her face, that mask of aristocratic superiority she'd worn for so many years, was finally stripped bare, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. Magistrate Edmund Whitmore was a man of 60, with silver whiskers and a reputation for impartiality. He surveyed the assembled witnesses with grave attention. Sebastian Austin, Duke of Middleborough, Mr. Henry Blackwood, Mrs. Isabel Rogers, Dr. James Thornton, the physician's widow, bearing her late husband's journal, and Thomas Green, the former stablemaster who had found Charles Smith's body, and Amber, seated beside Sebastian, her hand clasped tightly in his. "This is a farce," Lady Tilly spat. "I am a titled widow, a woman of standing in this community. These accusations are slander, orchestrated by a lovesick duke and a delusional servant girl." "You will remain silent unless addressed directly, Lady Hopkins." Magistrate Whitmore's voice cut through her protests like a gavel. "Or I will have you gagged as well as shackled." Lady Tilly's mouth snapped shut, though her eyes burned with impotent fury. "Mrs. Rogers," the magistrate said, "please present your testimony." The housekeeper stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held her written statement, but her voice when she spoke was clear and unwavering. "I have served at Hopkins Manor for 20 years. I witnessed the marriage of Lady Tilly Hopkins to Charles Smith in the spring of 1876. I witnessed his death 4 years ago under circumstances that were suspicious." She paused, gathering courage. "Mr. Smith's horse, Galileo, was the gentlest creature in the stable. On the morning of his death, I overheard Mr. Smith and Lady Hopkins arguing violently in the study. He accused her of forging documents related to the estate accounts. He threatened to seek legal counsel." "That's a lie!" Lady Tilly surged forward, but the constables forced her back into her chair. 3 hours later, Mrs. Rogers continued, her voice strengthening, "Mr. Smith was found dead at the base of the garden fountain, his horse standing calmly nearby. Lady Hopkins insisted the body be moved immediately, before the magistrate could examine the scene. Within a week, a revised will appeared, naming her as primary beneficiary and guardian to Miss Amber Smith." Magistrate Whitmore made careful notes. "And in the years following? I witnessed systematic abuse of Miss Amber. She was stripped of her inheritance, her position, her very identity. She was forced into servitude, beaten when she displeased Lady Hopkins, threatened with institutionalization in an asylum." Mrs. Rogers' voice cracked. 3 nights ago, I overheard Lady Hopkins meeting with a forger, creating yet another false will to further disinherit Miss Amber and justify her commitment to a lunatic asylum. She produced the notes she'd written immediately after that conversation, dated and detailed. "Mr. Green," the magistrate said next, "your testimony regarding Mr. Smith's death." The former stablemaster was a weathered man in his 50s, clearly uncomfortable in these formal surroundings, but his testimony was damning. "I found Mr. Smith's body that morning, sir. The injuries didn't match a simple fall from a spooked horse. His neck showed bruising consistent with hands, like someone had grabbed him from behind, and Galileo showed no signs of distress whatsoever. I tried to tell the constable, but Lady Hopkins offered me £50 and a glowing reference if I'd accept employment elsewhere. I took it, God forgive me. I needed the money." "You accept responsibility for your complicity?" "I do, sir, and I'm willing to face whatever consequences come from it. But that woman," he pointed at Lady Tilly, "she murdered Mr. Smith as sure as I'm standing here."
Dr. Thornton's widow presented her late husband's journal next, her hands carefully turning to the relevant pages. The physician's private notes described injuries that suggested violence rather than accident, observations that never made it into his official report. "My husband was a good man," she said quietly, "but he was also afraid. Lady Hopkins threatened to ruin his practice if he didn't alter his findings. He complied, but his conscience tormented him until his death. This journal is his confession." Finally, Mr. Blackwood presented the forged will that Lady Tilly had commissioned, along with testimony from 2 handwriting experts who confirmed it was fraudulent. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. Magistrate Whitmore set down his pen and fixed Lady Tilly with a stare that could freeze fire. "Lady Tilly Hopkins, you are hereby charged with the murder of Charles Smith, attempted murder of Amber Smith, fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. You will be remanded to custody pending trial at the assizes." "No!" Lady Tilly lunged to her feet, chains rattling. "I am a titled lady. You cannot—" "Your title will not protect you from the gallows," the magistrate said coldly. "Constables, remove her." As they dragged Lady Tilly toward the door, she twisted back toward Amber, her face contorted with hatred. "You think you've won? You think the Duke will still want you after the scandal of this trial? You're nothing, Amber Smith, nothing but damaged goods." Sebastian stood, his voice ringing with authority. "Magistrate Whitmore, I wish to make a formal declaration." "Proceed, Your Grace." "Miss Amber Smith and I are betrothed. The banns will be read this Sunday. She is under my protection and will soon be Duchess of Middleborough." He looked directly at Lady Tilly. "And yes, I still want her. I will always want her." Lady Tilly's scream of rage echoed through the building as the constables hauled her away. When silence finally fell, Amber found herself trembling. Sebastian's arm came around her shoulders, steady and warm. "It's over," he murmured. "She can't hurt you any more." Amber looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, not tears of grief, but of relief so profound it felt like rebirth. "My father will have justice," Sebastian promised, "and you, Amber Smith, will have the life that was stolen from you." Mrs. Rogers approached them, her own eyes wet. "Your father would be so proud of you, child, so very proud." Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the town square. Hopkins Manor would be seized by the Crown pending the trial's outcome, its halls finally emptied of cruelty and lies. And Amber, for the first time in 4 years, allowed herself to believe in a future beyond survival, a future where she was not a ghost, but a woman beloved and free. The morning of Amber's wedding dawned clear and brilliant, the kind of spring day that seemed designed by heaven itself for new beginnings. She awoke in the guest chambers of Middleborough Hall, no longer an attic room with frozen floorboards, but a suite of elegant rooms overlooking the rose gardens. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, and the scent of jasmine drifted on the breeze. Mrs. Rogers stood beside the bed, tears already threatening to spill. "None of that," Amber said softly, sitting up. "This is a happy day." "The happiest," Mrs. Rogers agreed, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "But you'll forgive an old woman for remembering the little girl who used to help me bake scones in the kitchen and marveling at the duchess she's become. I'm not a duchess yet. You've been a duchess in everything but title since the day you were born, child. Today simply makes it official." The wedding gown had been commissioned by Sebastian himself, ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves and pearl buttons down the back. But it was the veil that made Amber's breath catch. Instead of traditional tulle, Sebastian had arranged for a crown woven from wild roses, the same blooms that grew along the Middleborough cliffs. "He remembered," Amber whispered, touching the soft petals, "what my father used to say about roses and thorns." Mrs. Rogers fastened the silver locket around Amber's neck, her father's portrait resting against her heart where it belonged. "He remembers everything about you, dear. That's how you know it's love." The chapel at Middleborough Hall was small but exquisite, its stained glass windows casting colored light across the stone floor. Every pew was filled with witnesses who had come not out of social obligation, but genuine joy. The servants from Hopkins Manor, finally free from Lady Tilly's tyranny. The magistrate and his wife, Dr. Thornton's widow, Thomas Green, the stable-master, uncomfortable in borrowed formal clothes, but beaming nonetheless. And at the front, waiting beside the altar, stood Sebastian Austin. He wore his military dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, but it was his expression that stole Amber's breath, the way he looked at her as she walked down the aisle, as if she were the answer to every question he'd never known to ask. The vicar's words washed over her in a blur of sacred promises. She heard herself speak her vows, heard Sebastian's voice, steady and sure, pledging his life to hers. Then his hands were cupping her face, and he was kissing her with a gentleness that made her believe, finally, that she was safe, that she was home. The wedding breakfast was held in the grand ballroom, where just 2 weeks earlier she had been unmasked and exposed. But today she entered not as an intruder, but as the Duchess of Middleborough, Sebastian's hand warm in hers. Abby Hopkins attended, her face tear-stained but genuinely remorseful. She approached Amber during the dancing, her hands twisting nervously. "Your Grace," she began, then stopped. "I don't know what to call you anymore." Amber is fine. The name felt strange on her own tongue now, weighted with new meaning. "I wanted to apologize for everything. I knew Mother was cruel to you, but I was too frightened of her to intervene. I was a coward."
Amber studied the girl who had once been her rival. Abby looked smaller now, stripped of her mother's machinations and forced to face the world without that toxic armor. "You were a child raised by a monster. That's not the same as being a monster yourself. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Perhaps not," Amber agreed, "but I'm giving it anyway. Carrying hatred is exhausting, Abby. I've spent 4 years weighed down by it. Today, I choose to be free." Abby's composure crumbled. She embraced Amber briefly, desperately, then fled before her tears could become a spectacle. As evening approached, Sebastian found Amber standing at the ballroom windows, staring out toward the distant cliffs. "Having regrets, Duchess?" he teased gently. "Not even one." She turned to face him. "But there's somewhere I need to go, somewhere we need to go together." He understood immediately. The cliffs. They rode there as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. The white chalk cliffs glowed in the fading light, and the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Sebastian helped Amber dismount, and together they walked to the edge, not the treacherous spot where Lady Tilly had pushed her, but a safer outcropping where wildflowers grew in defiant patches. Amber stood at the precipice, the wind catching her wedding gown and the crown of roses still nestled in her hair. Sebastian stood behind her, his arms circling her waist, anchoring her to safety and love. "My father used to bring me here,"
she said quietly. He'd tell me that these cliffs had stood for thousands of years and would stand for thousands more, that we were just small moments in the vastness of time, but our moments still mattered. He was right. Lady Tilly wanted to throw me from these cliffs, to erase me the way she erased him. Amber's hand rose to her locket. But I'm still here, we're still here, and she's the one who's been erased. Sebastian tightened his embrace. You're not just here, Amber. You're triumphant. You survived everything she threw at you and came out stronger. She turned in his arms, her amber eyes reflecting the sunset. Not stronger, just loved. That's what made the difference. You saw me when I was invisible. You fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. I will fight for you every day of our lives, Sebastian promised, even when the battles are small, even when the enemy is just a bad dream or a difficult morning. You'll never face anything alone again. Amber kissed him as the sun sank below the horizon, gilding the world in gold and rose. The cliffs that had nearly been her grave had become instead a monument to her survival, her victory, her future.
She was no longer the ash-covered servant girl hiding in the shadows of Hopkins Manor. She was Amber Austen, Duchess of Middleborough. She was beloved, she was free, and when she finally stepped back from the cliff's edge, it was not in fear or retreat, but in triumph. A woman who had faced the abyss and walked away crowned in wild roses, mistress of her own horizon at last. The stars began to emerge overhead, and Sebastian took her hand. "Shall we go home, my Duchess?" Amber smiled, and for the first time in 4 years the expression reached all the way to her eyes. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." And together they rode away from the cliffs toward Middleborough Hall, where lamplight glowed in every window, and a new life, one built on truth and love rather than lies and cruelty, awaited them both. The nightmare was over. The fairy tale had just begun. From the edge of a cliff to the arms of a man who saw her worth, Amber Smith learned that survival is not the same as living, and the truth, when spoken, has the power to set you free. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that cruelty never wins and that your destiny cannot be pushed aside by those who seek to diminish you, then do us one kindness. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear that they matter. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that speaks to the strength of the human heart. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Thank you for being part of this journey. Until the next story, remember, you are seen, you are valued, and your story is worth telling.